In a world dominated by the Ottoman Empire, the Mediterranean teetered on the brink of a new era. The Holy League, a coalition of European powers, faced a seemingly insurmountable Ottoman fleet. But beneath the surface lay an ingenious secret weapon that would turn the tide. 3 points. The Ottomans, with their centuries-long dominance, were blindsided by the Galleasses, 6 massive, heavily armed ships that the Ottomans had never encountered before. Don John of Austria, a young but formidable commander, strategically positioned these galleasses to break the Ottoman line before it could close in for a traditional boarding fight. As the battle raged on, the galleasses' devastating broadsides decimated the Ottoman fleet, shattering their myth of invincibility and marking a pivotal shift in naval warfare. Discover the full story of Lepanto and how a few ingenious ships and a daring young commander changed the course of history. Dive into the legacy of this epic naval battle today. The morning of October 7th, 1571, broke gray and hostile over the Gulf of Patras. A wind from the east, cold and deliberate, pushed against the Christian fleet as it rowed westward from the mouth of the Gulf, bending every sail back against its mast and forcing the oarsmen to dig deep against the chop. The water was the color of slate. The sky above was the color of old iron, and stretching across 3 miles of open sea, moving toward the Christians with the confidence of a civilization that had not lost a major naval battle in 40 years, came the Ottoman fleet, 278 galleys and smaller vessels, their banks of oars rising and falling in unison, their crescent-emblazoned battle standards snapping in the wind that favored them, the red and gold of their flags reflecting off the surface of the water, like something born from fire. The Holy League fleet that turned to meet them was smaller. 212 galleys, fewer men, fewer ships. The Ottoman Admiral Ali Pasha, surveying the Christian line from the deck of his great galley Sultana, had every reason to believe that he was about to add another victory to the long, glorious list of Ottoman naval triumphs stretching back generations. He had more vessels, he had more soldiers, he had the wind, and he had the weight of history behind him. The knowledge that his empire had dominated these waters since before most of the men in that Christian fleet were born. What Ali Pasha could not see from that distance, what his scouts had failed to comprehend, and his intelligence had failed to report with accuracy, were 6 objects towed in front of the Christian battle line that did not exist anywhere in the Ottoman Navy's experience. They were enormous. They were low in the water and bristling with something that, as the 2 fleets drew closer in the morning light, resolved itself into the shapes of heavy gun barrels, dozens of them, pointing outward in every direction from hulls wide enough to mount batteries that a normal galley could never carry. They were the Venetian Galleasses, and their captains were already loading their guns. The Ottomans had never seen anything like them. Within 6 hours of that meeting, the Ottoman fleet would be shattered. Ali Pasha would be dead, his head displayed on a pike from a Christian galley. More than 200 Ottoman ships would be captured or sent to the bottom. 30,000 Ottoman sailors and soldiers would be killed or taken prisoner. 12,000 Christian galley slaves, chained to their oars in the bellies of Ottoman ships, would be freed. And the century-long myth of Ottoman naval invincibility, the dread certainty that had spread across every court in Europe, that had kept Christian merchants off their own sea, that had made the crescent banner feel like fate, would lie broken and bleeding on the surface of the Gulf of Patras. This battle changed the Mediterranean forever, not because it destroyed Ottoman power. The empire rebuilt its fleet within a year, and the sea remained contested for decades, but because it proved, once and for the first time in 50 years, that the thing everyone feared most was not invincible. It was simply a fleet, and fleets can be beaten. The weapon that broke it was something new, something the Venetians had been quietly building for years while everyone else argued about diplomacy and finance and the proper composition of an alliance that seemed constitutionally incapable of agreeing on anything. 6 ships. 6 enormous, ungainly, cannon-stuffed ships that had to be towed into position because they were too heavy to be rowed effectively. 6 weapons that the Ottoman Navy had never planned for, never trained against, and never imagined they would need to. This is the story of Lepanto, of the secret weapon that shattered the Ottoman Navy, of the last great galley battle in the history of the Western world, and of the October morning when the most powerful naval force in the Mediterranean learned that the future had already passed them by. The world before the battle. To understand the scale of dread that preceded Lepanto, you have to understand what the Ottoman Empire meant to Europe in 1571. Not what it means in retrospect, with the benefit of knowing how the story ends. What it meant in the moment to the men who lived under its shadow and had no idea whether they were witnessing its peak or whether the expansion would simply continue until there was nothing left to expand into. What it meant to the Venetian merchant who watched his trading posts fall one by one to Ottoman forces. What it meant to the Spanish soldier told to prepare for a naval engagement against an enemy that had beaten every fleet sent against it for a generation. What it meant to Pope Pius V, kneeling in his private chapel every morning, praying for a miracle that showed no sign of arriving. The Ottoman Empire in 1571 was the most powerful state in the world, and it had been expanding for longer than any living European could remember. Constantinople had fallen in 1453, and from that moment the empire had grown in every direction with the relentless, accumulated momentum of an organism that had learned to feed on conquest. It had taken Serbia, Bosnia, and Albania. It had taken Hungary at the devastating Battle of Mohacs in 1526, killing the Hungarian king and most of his aristocracy in a single afternoon. It had besieged Vienna, its corsair allies, the pirate lords of the Barbary coast, men like the great Hayreddin Barbarossa, had terrorized the western Mediterranean for decades, raiding Spanish and Italian coastlines, carrying off thousands of Christians into slavery, disrupting the trade that European cities depended on for their survival. At sea, the Ottoman record was particularly frightening. The Battle of Preveza in 1538 had seen an Ottoman fleet under Hayreddin Barbarossa destroy a combined Christian force assembled by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and commanded by the Genoese Admiral Andrea Doria, the uncle of the man who would command the Christian right wing at Lepanto. The defeat at Preveza had been humiliating and thorough, and its consequences had been felt for 3 decades. Christian naval power in the eastern Mediterranean had never fully recovered. The Ottomans had taken Rhodes from the Knights Hospitaller in 1522. They had taken Tripoli. They controlled the sea lanes from the Aegean to the Adriatic with a confidence born from the knowledge that nothing yet assembled against them had proved capable of taking those lanes away. And now they had taken Cyprus. The island of Cyprus had been a Venetian possession for nearly a century, a crucial node in the Mediterranean trading network that Venice had built and maintained and defended as the foundation of its commercial empire. In 1570, the Ottomans invaded it with a force of 50,000 men. The city of Nicosia fell after a brief siege, and the Ottomans massacred much of its population. The last Venetian hold on the island was the fortress city of Famagusta, which held out with extraordinary courage under its commander, Marco Antonio Bragadin, for nearly a year against vastly superior numbers. When Famagusta finally fell in August 1571, after a siege that cost the Ottomans 50,000 dead, the commander, Lala Kara Mustafa Pasha, broke the terms of surrender he had sworn. He imprisoned the Venetian officers, tortured them, and then had Marco Antonio Bragadin publicly flayed alive, skinned from head to toe, while the Ottoman soldiers watched. Bragadin's stuffed skin was subsequently paraded through the streets of Constantinople as a trophy. News of what happened to Bragadin reached the Holy League fleet at Corfu on the eve of its departure for Lepanto. Some of the Galleasses in the Christian left wing were commanded by Bragadin's kinsmen, the brothers Ambrosio and Antonio, who meant to answer for their relative's death in the only language the situation invited. The architect of the response to all of this, the Cyprus invasion, the fall of Famagusta, the accumulated humiliations of 50 years, was Pope Pius V. He was a Dominican friar who had become pope in 1566, a man of austere personal habits and volcanic political energy, who understood with complete clarity that the Ottoman advance required a coordinated military response that Europe had thus far proven structurally incapable of mounting. The problem was not will, or not only will. It was the ancient Christian disease of internal division, the inability of states whose interests constantly conflicted with each other to set those conflicts aside long enough to face the common threat. Spain and Venice were natural candidates for an alliance, but they distrusted each other profoundly. Venice was a trading republic that dealt commercially with the Ottomans when it was convenient and resented Spanish interference in Italian politics. Spain was a crusading monarchy that regarded Venice as insufficiently committed to the faith and suspected Venetian neutrality was really Venetian opportunism. The Genoese, whose finest admiral, Andrea Doria, would command the Holy League's right wing, had their own quarrels with Venice going back generations. The Knights of St. John, based at Malta, had their own interests and their own pride, and were not easily subordinated to anyone's command structure. But Pius V was a man who could move immovable objects through the pure force of moral argument and political pressure applied without remission. He negotiated, cajoled, threatened, and prayed. He assembled the Holy League, and he found in the person of a 24-year-old illegitimate prince exactly the commander who could make the alliance's military potential actual. Don John of Austria, Juan de Austria, born in 1547, the illegitimate son of Emperor Charles V and a German noblewoman, was 24 years old when he was given command of the Holy League fleet. He was young for the responsibility. He was legitimate enough for it only by the grace of his half-brother, Philip II of Spain, who could have chosen someone else, but recognized something in this young man that the fleet would need. Don John was what military historians call a fighting general, not a cautious administrator of resources, not a political animal calculating risks and protecting careers, but a man whose instinct in every situation was to close with the enemy and force a decision. He had suppressed the Morisco revolt in Granada in 1570 with a ferocity that left no doubt about what he was capable of. He had a genuine gift for personal command, for riding the deck of a ship in the middle of a naval engagement and making every man who saw him feel that the outcome was not in doubt. He also had the intelligence to understand what he did not know and to ask the right questions of the people who knew more than he did. The Ottoman commander, Muezzin Ali Pasha, was an experienced court official who had been appointed Grand Admiral, Capudan Pasha, by Sultan Selim II. He was not a sailor born to the sea in the way that Hayreddin Barbarossa had been, not a corsair who had grown up on these waters and knew every current and hidden shoal. He was a capable administrator and a brave man, as his conduct in the battle would prove, but he was leading a fleet that expected to win on the basis of an established playbook, the crescent formation, the flanking maneuver, the boarding action, that had worked for 40 years and had given no one in the Ottoman naval establishment a strong reason to develop anything new. On his left wing was the man who would come closest to salvaging the Ottoman cause, Uluç Ali Reis, the Algerian corsair, a former Christian slave named Giovanni the Inigi Galeni, who had converted to Islam and risen through the Barbary pirate world to become Beyler Bey of Algiers. He was arguably the finest tactical mind on either side of the battle. He was certainly the only Ottoman commander who understood intuitively that the coming battle was not going to be fought the way Ottoman naval battles had been fought before. On the Ottoman right, commanding the wing that would oppose the Christian left near the shore, was Mehmed Sirocco, an Egyptian officer who knew the shallow coastal waters near Lepanto better than any other commander in the fleet, and who had his own plan for the battle that depended entirely on that knowledge. The stage was set. The forces were assembled. The autumn of 1571 was preparing to host the largest naval battle in the history of the Western world since the age of ancient Rome. The preparations. The Gulf of Patras is a long, relatively narrow body of water that opens westward into the Ionian Sea through a passage guarded on its northern side by the Cape of Scrofa. To the south and east, the hills of the Peloponnese rise from the shoreline. The town of Lepanto, now Paktos in Greek, the ancient harbor from which the Gulf takes its name, sits at the eastern end of the Gulf, on the northern shore, where the waters narrow between the Greek mainland and the mouth of the Gulf of Corinth. This geography mattered enormously, and both commanders understood it. Ali Pasha had anchored his fleet at Lepanto itself, and when he sailed west on the morning of October 7th to meet the Holy League, he was coming out of sheltered waters into the open Gulf with the wind behind him. The Christian fleet was rowing east into that same wind, which pushed against their sails and forced the oarsmen to work hard against the chop. The Ottoman advantage was real. The wind was real. The mathematics of 278 ships against 212 was real. But the Gulf's northern shore created a constraint that Mehmed Sirocco on the Ottoman right would attempt to exploit, and that would instead help destroy him. The shallow water near the coast limited his maneuvering room. The sandbanks and rocky outcroppings that only he knew thoroughly were exactly the terrain on which he planned to trap the Christian left, but they were also the terrain on which his own ships would ground and founder when the battle went wrong. For his 6 galleasses, Don John had a specific plan. These ships could not keep up with the galleys. They were too heavy, too broad in the beam, too dependent on their sails in a situation where the wind was moving against them. Towing them into position at the front of the battle line, anchoring them ahead of each of the 3 Christian wings, required hours of slow, laborious work beginning before dawn. The galleasses sat there, between the 2 approaching fleets, while the Ottoman fleet came on, and the Ottomans, as they drew closer, began to realize they were looking at something they had never planned for. A Venetian galleass displaced approximately 700 tons, compared to the 150 tons of a standard war galley. It carried a crew of nearly 700 men, half of whom were oarsmen working in organized shifts, rather than in the desperate, exhausting, continuous pull of a battle galley. Most critically, it mounted artillery in a configuration that violated every principle of traditional galley warfare. Where a galley's offensive power was concentrated in its ram at the bow, the bronze-tipped ram that had been the decisive weapon of Mediterranean naval combat since the ancient Greeks, and supplemented by a handful of light forward-facing guns, a galleass was a floating battery. It carried heavy guns along its sides, firing broadsides, and it carried lighter pieces fore and aft, covering every direction. A single galleass fired 326 pounds of shot with each broadside, more than 3.5 times what a galley could manage from its forward battery. Don John had 4 of his 6 galleasses properly positioned before the Ottoman fleet arrived. 2 were placed ahead of the Christian center, 2 ahead of the Christian left wing under the Venetian Admiral Agostino Barbarigo. The 2 assigned to the Christian right under Andrea Doria were never properly deployed. Doria was already being drawn south by Uluç Ali's feinting maneuver, and in the confusion, the galleasses never reached their assigned positions. This would matter. But 4 out of 6 was enough to begin something irreversible. The Christian fleet itself was organized into 3 divisions flanking a center. Don John personally commanded the center with approximately 70 galleys, flying his personal standard alongside the flagship Real, a magnificent vessel painted in gold and red, and flying a banner from the Pope himself. To his left, closest to the northern shore, Agostino Barbarigo commanded 53 galleys. On the right, in the southward extending wing that was already being pulled away from the main line by Ottoman maneuvering, Andrea Doria commanded another 53. 38 galleys held in reserve under Don Álvaro de Bazan, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, sat half a mile behind the main line, watching, waiting to be sent where they were needed most. The troops embarked in the Christian galleys reflected the coalition nature of the Holy League. Spanish infantry, the finest heavy infantry in Europe, the veterans of the Italian wars, men in breastplates and helmets who loaded their arquebuses with practiced efficiency, formed the core of the boarding force. Venetian soldiers, Genoese, Knights of Malta, German volunteers, papal troops. 18,000 soldiers in total, and crucially, most of them armed with firearms. Arquebuses and muskets, ranged weapons that could kill at 30 yards rather than the 3 yards of a sword, that could tear through the light armor of an Ottoman sailor or soldier before he could close the distance to use his blade. The Ottoman troops were armed differently. The Janissaries, those elite infantry that were the empire's finest, carried the same firearms. But the bulk of Ottoman combat troops relied on bows. The composite recurve bow in Ottoman hands was a devastating weapon, faster to load than any firearm, accurate at extraordinary ranges, capable of putting 15 arrows in the air per minute from a trained archer. Ottoman archers had outclassed Christian crossbowmen for generations, but at Lepanto, Don John's forces were not carrying crossbows. They were carrying arquebuses that fired a lead ball with enough force to stop a man through the wooden side of a galley hull. The Ottomans' bows could not say the same. The night before the battle passed differently for the men of each fleet. In the Christian fleet, Don John ordered Mass celebrated on every ship before dawn, the priests moving in the guttering candlelight from deck to deck, the soldiers kneeling on planking that still smelled of the Ionian Sea and the weeks of provisions. Many of these men had been at sea since July, had eaten salt meat and ship's biscuit for 3 months, had lived with the particular misery of galley life, the cramped quarters, the smell of hundreds of bodies in a confined space, the perpetual dampness, the heat in summer, and the chill of autumn nights. They were tired. Some of them were sick. Some had never been in a naval battle and had been trying not to think about what the next morning would demand of them. The priests gave them something to think about instead. They spoke of Cyprus. They spoke of Famagusta. They spoke of Bragadin, of what was done to him, of the crosses torn down and the churches desecrated, and the thousands of Christians carried into slavery in the holds of the ships now anchored 50 miles up that gulf. There was no shortage of real atrocity to narrate. The men heard it, and some of them prayed, and some of them sharpened their blades, and some of them simply stared at the dark water and thought their own thoughts. Don John himself walked the decks of the Real in the hour before dawn. He spoke to the soldiers individually, not the formal, grand speech of command, but the quieter thing, the man-to-man exchange that good commanders know how to deploy. He was 24 years old, and he had the gift of making people feel, in the moment of speaking with him, that the outcome was settled, and all that remained was the work. It was not bravado. It was something closer to certainty, and certainty is more contagious than any disease. Among the galley slaves chained to their oars in the holds of the Ottoman fleet, the night passed in a different kind of prayer. Thousands of Christian men, captured in raids on European coasts, or taken from ships or enslaved after military defeats, had been rowing Ottoman galleys for years, some for decades, their ankles raw against their chains, their backs broken from the labor. They knew a battle was coming because they could feel it, in the changed rhythm of the fleet's movement, in the orders they heard shouted above them, in the absence of the usual routine. They could not do anything with what was coming except survive it and hope. For the 6 galleasses anchored in front of the battle line, dawn revealed the Ottoman fleet already forming its battle order. Their gun crews began their preparations in the gray light, with the focused efficiency of men who had drilled for exactly this moment. The silence that preceded the collision was brief, and then it ended forever. They saw each other at first light, 2 colossal formations of ships moving toward each other across the gray water of the Gulf, each fleet extending 3 miles from wing to tip, filling the horizon from north to south with the shapes of hundreds of galleys, the colored banners of a dozen nations and twice as many noble houses, the glint of armor and the flash of oar blades catching the morning light. The sound began before the ships were close. Drums first, the Ottoman battle drums, that deep, insistent rhythm that had preceded Ottoman armies and fleets into battle for 100 years. A sound that had been heard outside Vienna, outside Famagusta, outside every stronghold the Crescent Banner had ever besieged or taken. The sound carried across the water with its full intended weight, its message requiring no translation. The Ottoman fleet was confident. The Ottoman fleet always arrived to the sound of drums, and the drums said, "We have done this before, and we will do it again." From the Christian galleys, an answer, the deep boom of a single cannon shot from the Real, Don John's personal signal, the prearranged announcement to every ship in the line that the flagship was visible and the fleet's commander was ready. Then mass noise, the sounds of 300 galleys worth of oarsmen finding their rhythm, the creak of oarlocks and the plunge of blades, the shouted orders of boatswains keeping the stroke, the metallic sounds of armored soldiers moving to their boarding positions on the foredecks, the click and snap of arquebus locks being checked and rechecked and checked again. The wind had been against the Christians all morning. Then, at approximately 10 o'clock, it died. It did not reverse. It simply stopped. The Ionian wind dropping to nothing in the span of a minute, leaving the Gulf suddenly, entirely still. The sails of both fleets going slack at once. And then, slowly, almost experimentally, it reversed. It began to blow from the west, into the Ottoman fleet's faces, behind the Christian oarsmen. It was not a miracle. It was an October morning on the Ionian Sea, and the winds in these waters are capricious. But the men in both fleets felt it as something more than meteorology. The Christian soldiers crossed themselves. The Ottoman oarsmen noted the change with the apprehension of men who understand that fortune has shifted its weight without explanation. The Galleasses fired first. At approximately 10:20 in the morning, when the Ottoman fleet was still approaching in its crescent formation, the great curved line of 278 ships moving east with the practiced confidence of 40 years of victories, the galleass commanders gave the order. From ranges of up to a mile, distances at which no galley gun could be even approximately accurate, the heavy broadside batteries of the Venetian weapons opened up. The first gun crews put shot after shot into the approaching Ottoman lines with a methodical, devastating precision that the Ottoman sailors had simply never experienced. These were not the forward-firing light pieces of a conventional galley, firing once and then requiring the ship to turn. These were broadside batteries, multiple heavy guns firing at overlapping intervals, putting iron balls into the water and into the Ottoman hulls at a rate that bore no relationship to anything the Ottomans' tactical doctrine had prepared them for. A galleass firing a full broadside was louder than anything else on that body of water. A continuous, rolling, flat percussion thunder that physically hurt the ears of anyone within a quarter mile, and that was felt as much as heard in the rib cage of every Ottoman sailor in the approaching fleet. Ottoman galleys began to die before the two main lines had closed within boarding range. This was the new thing. This was the thing that had never happened before. In 40 years of Ottoman naval victory, a Mediterranean battle had always developed in a predictable sequence. The two fleets approached each other. The forward-firing gallery guns exchanged fire at close range. The rams drove into opposing hulls or missed and allowed the ships to lock together. And then the real battle began. The boarding action. Soldiers leaping across the rail onto enemy decks. The sword and spear and bow and arquebus at close range. The killing at arm's length that decided who was left standing when the smoke cleared. The Ottoman fleet was magnificent at every phase of this sequence. It had practiced this sequence for generations. But the galleasses were disrupting the sequence before it could begin. Ottoman ships were being hit and damaged and slowed and sunk at distances where the crews could not yet see the individual faces of the people killing them. Their forward guns couldn't reach the galleasses at that range. Their archers couldn't reach them either. The Ottoman commanders shouted orders to change course, to maneuver around the galleasses, to find the gaps in the forward line and push through before the damage mounted further. But galleys in formation maneuver slowly, and the Ottoman fleet was already in its battle formation, its ships packed tightly in the crescent line, and the options available to individual captains were limited by the ships on either side of them. Some ships tried to turn, some turned into each other, some pressed forward into the fire because pressing forward was what their orders said to do, and their commanders had not yet been killed, and they could think of nothing else. Within 20 minutes, The forward Ottoman formation had been broken. Not routed, broken. Ships out of their assigned positions, gaps in the crescent where vessels had gone dead in the water, or were circling with damaged oars, or had simply turned away from the fire without orders. The Galleasses, having fired their initial volleys, pulled their anchors and began maneuvering to continue the action. But by now the two main fleets had closed to boarding range, and the battle became something different. 100 individual engagements simultaneously, the 3-mile line of the two fleets dissolving into a chaos of locked ships and fighting men that no commander on either side could fully see or control. The smell of the battle reached the men before the full chaos of it was visible to them. Gunpowder smoke has a particular character at sea. It does not drift away the way it does on an open field, but hangs in layers over the water, mixing with the salt air and the smell of burning wood and the sharper, copper-tasting smell of blood, creating a visibility problem that commanders who trained on land had no doctrine for managing. By 30 minutes into the fight, the center of the battle was obscured from both flanks by a gray-black wall of smoke that moved with the light west wind, thinning at the edges but dense and impenetrable at its heart. The two flagship galleys and their attendants reduced to silhouettes and the sounds of combat without the visual information that commanders needed to make decisions. The oarsmen in the Christian galleys worked through all of it without stopping. They were the foundation of everything, the men whose labor moved the fleet, who kept the ships in position, who strained against the resistance of 300 gallons of seawater per oar stroke, while above them soldiers fought and bled and occasionally fell back into the rowing benches, and the orders of the boatswains kept the stroke, and the drums kept the rhythm, and the battle happened over their heads without ceasing. They could not see the fight. They could feel it in the shocks transmitted through the hull when a cannonball struck, in the sudden lurch when a ship came alongside and locked, in the change in the rhythm of their own labour when the galleys stopped moving forward, and the orders became something other than stroke and stroke and stroke. By mid-morning, the Christian left wing was in crisis. Agostino Barbarigo, commanding the Venetian galleys on the northern shore, faced the Ottoman right wing under Mehmed Sirocco, who had his ships close to the coast and was attempting the flanking manoeuvre he had planned, driving north, hugging the shallows that only he knew, trying to get behind the Christian left and crush it between the shore and the main Ottoman line. Barbarigo responded by ordering his galleys further north to close the gap between his wing and the coastline, preventing the Ottoman flanking move from developing. He nearly succeeded. But the effort pulled his wing out of its formation, and the fighting became desperate. Ship by ship, deck by deck, the Venetian and Ottoman soldiers killing each other in the narrow space between oarlocks and railings, the oarsmen chained below, receiving the dead from above, and listening to the battle without being able to see it. Barbarigo himself was struck. An Ottoman arrow, the last great demonstration of Ottoman archery as a naval weapon, because after Lepanto, archery would give way entirely to firearms, found his eye through the opening in his visor. He was carried below, dying. But his captains held the line. The left wing did not break, and Mehmed Sirocco's plan died in the shallow water when his ships, pressing north toward the shore, ran onto the very sandbars he had counted on to protect his flank. Ottoman galleys grounded. Their oars snapped against the bottom. The crews were exposed and immobile, and the Christian ships came at them with everything they had. Mehmed Sirocco himself was killed, pulled from the water by Christian sailors after his flagship went down, killed on the deck of his captor's vessel. His wing, caught between the shore and the fighting Christian galleys, collapsed. At the center, something was happening that neither fleet had experienced. Don John's galley, the Real, and Ali Pasha's flagship, the Sultana, had been heading toward each other since the battle began. Two commanders who understood, consciously or instinctively, that this was the kind of battle decided by the flagships, that the moral and practical center of the whole engagement was the question of which supreme commander was still standing when the smoke cleared. The two great galleys came together with the crash of timber and bronze that people on both wings could hear through the general roar of the battle, their rams locking, their decks bridged by boarding planks, and by the sheer pressure of the two ships grinding against each other. The fighting on the deck of the Sultana was among the most intense of the entire battle. The Real was boarded twice by Ottoman soldiers, and twice driven back, the Christian infantry falling back and then surging forward again. The Janissaries in their distinctive dress cutting their way across the deck with the professional ferocity that made them the most feared infantry in the world. Don John fought, not from a distance, not from the command position that a careful general might have preferred, but with a sword, on his own deck, in the middle of the killing. His personal guard fought beside him. His officers fought. The sound of that encounter, steel on steel and steel on bone, and the particular percussion of arquebus fire at arm's length distance, where the smoke from the barrel obscured the target at the moment of shooting, was a sound that the survivors of the Real would describe for the rest of their lives. The Turkish soldiers who boarded the Real were not fighting badly. They were the Janissaries, the best troops the Empire produced, trained from childhood for exactly this kind of close-quarters violence, and they fought with everything that training had built in them. For the duration of the first boarding, and part of the second, they were winning. The Christian infantry fell back a step, and another step, and the Janissaries advanced, and the decks were slick with blood, and the noise was absolute, and there was a point in that engagement when the outcome of the entire battle rested on whether the soldiers on the Real could hold their ground for another 5 minutes, while the larger tactical situation resolved. They held. 3 times the Ottoman flag over the Sultana was cut down. 3 times it was raised again. The fighting was so dense, so close, so terrible, that men could not always tell which body next to them was an enemy and which was a friend, and the killing continued by instinct and momentum, long past the point where individual decisions could be made. Then Ali Pasha was shot. An arquebus ball, fired from close range by a Christian soldier somewhere in the melee on the Sultana's deck, struck the Ottoman Grand Admiral in the head. He fell. For a moment, just a moment, the fighting around him continued from its own momentum. Then the Ottoman soldiers near him understood what had happened, and the understanding spread outward from that point in the way that understanding of disaster always spreads in a battle, faster than any order, changing the texture of the fighting before the men further away knew what they were reacting to. A Christian soldier cut off Ali Pasha's head. It was raised on a pike above the captured Sultana. The Ottoman battle standard, the sacred green banner embroidered with verses from the Koran that had flown over the flagship, was hauled down, and the flag of the Holy League raised in its place. The effect on the Ottoman center was immediate and catastrophic. Men who had been fighting with the disciplined determination of a fleet that expected to win looked up and saw their admiral's head on a pole above their own flagship. They had no reserve of psychological preparation for this. Ottoman naval doctrine did not plan for this moment, because this moment had not occurred in 40 years. The center began to buckle. By early afternoon, the Ottoman center had collapsed entirely. Dozens of ships were captured. Their crews below decks unchained the Christian slaves and handed them weapons that were used to kill the guards above. The Sultana's treasure, Ali Pasha's personal chest, full of gold and jewels and dispatches, fell to Christian hands. The battle in the center was over. But on the Christian right, the battle was still very much alive, and it was going badly. Uluç Ali, commanding the Ottoman left wing, had executed a feinting maneuver south that drew Andrea Doria's galleys away from the main Christian line, opening a gap between the Christian center and the Christian right. Doria, a cautious commander who feared being flanked as much as he feared a direct engagement, kept moving south to cover his flank. The gap grew wider. Uluç Ali, who had been waiting for exactly this, turned north and drove through it. The Ottoman corsair commander struck the exposed flank of the Christian center with everything he had. He captured the flagship of the Knights of Malta. He took several other ships. For a terrifying period in the early afternoon, when the Ottoman center was already breaking, but the Christian right was in disarray, and the gap in the line was real and widening, Lepanto could still have produced a different result. Not an Ottoman victory, the center was too far gone for that, but something messier, bloodier, and less complete on the Christian side. What stopped Uluç Ali was the reserve. Don Alvaro de Bazan, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, had 38 galleys that had not yet been engaged. He had been watching the battle from his position half a mile behind the main line, assessing, calculating, waiting for the moment when the reserve could be decisive rather than merely useful. That moment had arrived. He drove his galleys into the gap, hitting Uluç Ali's penetrating force from the unexpected direction, and the combination of the counterattack and the collapse of the Ottoman center, which left Uluç Ali with no support on his flanks and no flagship to report to, forced the Algerian corsair to make a decision. He made the right one. Uluç Ali gathered his remaining ships, perhaps 60 galleys, and withdrew. He did not rout. He did not panic. He retreated in good order, the Algerian admiral refusing to sacrifice his command in a battle that was already decided, already lost, already becoming the kind of catastrophe that would define the Ottoman Navy's relationship with itself for the next generation. He took his flag of Malta trophy with him. He set course for Constantinople. The battle was over. The silence that followed was not actually silence. 3 miles of sea covered with the wreckage of 200 ships and 30,000 dead men does not produce silence. It produces a different kind of sound. The sound of things ending, the sound of fire on wood, and the groaning of hulls working in the swell, and the distant, diminishing oar splash of the last Ottoman ships pulling away through the smoke. Don John of Austria stood on the deck of the Real and looked at what the day had made. The immediate aftermath. The counting began before the smoke had fully cleared. The Ottoman fleet had lost over 200 ships, approximately 80 sunk and 130 captured, their hulls hauled into the Christian lines or secured with boarding parties while the fighting was still flickering in the southern part of the Gulf. The losses in men were staggering. Somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 Ottoman sailors and soldiers died at Lepanto, killed in the fighting on the decks and in the water, and in the burning of ships too damaged to be worth saving. Another 8,000 were taken prisoner. The Grand Admiral's head was still on its pike. The sacred green banner of the Sultana was already being packed for transport to Rome, where Pope Pius V would receive it as the material evidence of a miracle he had prayed for. 12,000 Christian galley slaves were freed. 12,000 men who had been chained to Ottoman oar benches, who had rowed through battles and storms and years of Mediterranean voyaging, without the prospect of freedom visible in any direction, stood on the decks of captured ships in the October afternoon, and understood that the thing they had stopped believing would happen had happened. Some of them were so weak from years of captivity that they had to be helped to stand. Some of them had been slaves long enough to have forgotten the languages of the countries they came from. The Christian losses were real and painful. Approximately 7,500 dead, 8,000 wounded. Agostino Barbarigo, the Venetian admiral of the left wing who had closed the coastal gap and held his line against Mehmed Sirocco's flanking maneuver, died of his arrow wound later that day, still on his flagship, surrounded by the officers who had fought under him. He had not broken. His wing had not broken. It was enough. Among the wounded was a young Spanish soldier named Miguel de Cervantes, 24 years old, who received 3 gunshot wounds in the fighting, 2 in the chest and 1 in his left hand, which the wound and its infection eventually left permanently disabled. Cervantes would later describe Lepanto as the greatest event that past centuries had seen, or future ones could hope to witness. He called the day he lost the use of his hand the most glorious of his life. The man who would write Don Quixote had spent his most formative hours in the smoke and blood of a galley battle in the Gulf of Patras, and he carried that day inside him for the rest of his life. The battlefield itself, as the afternoon of October 7th gave way to evening, was a vast field of wreckage extending 3 miles across the mouth of the Gulf. Galleys with their oars burned away, masts standing in the water at angles, their sails still attached and floating, slowly waterlogging. The bodies of the dead, thousands of them, drifting with the current. Planking and barrels and ropes and the personal effects of men who had started the day in the service of 2 different empires and had ended it as debris. The water was dark with what the day had done. Don John, surveying this landscape from the Real as the light failed, was 24 years old. He had commanded the largest naval engagement in the history of the Western world since antiquity, had faced a fleet larger and more experienced than his own, and had won decisively. He would not live to see 50. But on this October evening, with the wreckage spreading around him and the 12,000 freed slaves finding their way to the surface of the ships he had taken, he had already done the thing for which history would remember him. The 6 Galleasses rode at anchor in the gathering dark. They had done their work. Their gun barrels were hot. Their decks needed cleaning. They were still, as they had been all day, too heavy to maneuver without assistance, dependent on the wind and the tow lines that had placed them and the morning's calm that had let them stay. They were ungainly and limited, and they required towing, and they fired too slowly for what came after. But they had broken the Ottoman line before the Ottoman line could close, and that rupture had been the first fact of every other fact that followed. The legacy. The news reached Rome 12 days later, brought by a fast ship that entered the Tiber to find the city already burning with celebration. Pope Pius V, according to witnesses, had turned from a meeting in mid-sentence and announced, with the certainty of a man describing something he had already seen, that the fleet had won a great victory. The story may be legend. The reaction was not. Rome celebrated. Venice exploded in days of ringing bells and public thanksgiving. All across Catholic Europe, the joy was the joy of people who had been waiting a very long time to believe that the thing bearing down on them could be stopped. But the Ottoman Empire rebuilt its fleet within a year. By the winter of 1571, Ottoman shipyards were working around the clock. By spring 1572, they had launched over 150 new galleys. The empire's industrial capacity, when directed at a naval problem, was staggering. It had access to the timber of Anatolia, the skilled workers of Constantinople and the Aegean ports, the organizational machinery of an imperial administration that had been producing warships for a century. Ulugh Ali, who had brought his 60 ships home to Constantinople in good order and had told the Ottoman court exactly what he had seen, was appointed Grand Admiral and immediately set about reforming the fleet along the lines of what Lepanto had revealed. Bigger ships, more guns, infantry armed with firearms rather than bows. The strategic consequences were more complicated than the simple joy of the victory suggested. Venice, exhausted and financially devastated by the loss of Cyprus and the costs of the war, made a separate peace with the Ottomans in 1573, ceding Cyprus formally and paying a war indemnity. The Holy League, deprived of its most important naval partner, dissolved without achieving any further military objectives. The gains from Lepanto were not followed up in the way that a different alliance with different politics might have followed them up. And yet the battle mattered, profoundly, permanently, in ways that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. What Lepanto destroyed was not the Ottoman Navy. It was the Ottoman Navy's myth. For a generation, the crescent banner at sea had carried the weight of invincibility, not just military capability, but something closer to destiny, the accumulated psychological pressure of 40 years of victories that had made Christian sailors feel in their bones that the outcome of any engagement with the Ottomans was predetermined. That myth died on October 7, 1571. It did not come back. The Ottomans rebuilt their ships, but they rebuilt them differently in the image of what had beaten them, which meant that Uluj Ali's new fleet was a tacit acknowledgement that the old way had been found wanting. But the Galleass itself was already becoming obsolete even as Lepanto was being commemorated in paintings and poems. The battle that the 6 Venetian supergalleys had helped decide was the last great galley engagement in the history of the Western world. The galley, that ancient instrument of Mediterranean naval power, the ship that had fought at Salamis and Actium and Preveza, had its final great day at Lepanto, and then began its long retirement. The future belonged to ships that could cross oceans, vessels carrying full sailing rigs and broadside batteries, ships that did not depend on oarsmen and therefore did not need to stay within range of food and fresh water. Ships that were already being built in Spanish and English and Dutch yards to meet the demands of the Atlantic trade routes and the age of exploration. Habsburg Spain, forced by the demands of the Americas to develop offshore sailing technology at a pace that the Mediterranean-focused Ottomans had no equivalent reason to match, was pulling ahead in naval architecture in ways that no number of rebuilt galleys could address. The Ottoman galley fleet that Uluj Ali reformed after Lepanto would eventually find itself facing Spanish and English galleons that represented a different era of warfare entirely. A ship from a different century, a weapon from a world the galley tradition had not prepared anyone to fight in. This was Lepanto's deepest legacy. It was the hinge point, the moment where the Mediterranean's long galley tradition met its end, and where the evidence of a new form of naval power was present, in embryo, in the 6 heavy vessels that had announced the battle with their broadside fire. The galleass pointed toward the ship of the line. The ship of the line would eventually rule the oceans. The oceans would eventually determine which civilization had the power to expand and which would contract. Miguel de Cervantes, who had fought with his left hand that day and lost the use of it and never regretted it, wrote about Lepanto for the rest of his life in the way that men write about the defining experience of their existence. Not as an event in the past, but as a continuing fact of the present, the morning that had made him what he was. He was wounded. He was cold. He was 24 years old, and he was fighting in the smoke on a galley deck in the Gulf of Patras. And somehow, in those hours, he was also present at the last great act of an ancient form of warfare, the final demonstration of an era that had lasted since the Greeks rode triremes at Salamis. Centuries later, the Gulf of Patras is a busy shipping lane. Ferries cross it between Greece and Italy, loaded with tourists and trucks. The water is the same color it was on that October morning, slate gray in autumn, the color of old iron. The wind still comes from the west in the afternoon, the same wind that stopped and reversed on the morning of October 7th, 1571, and gave a fleet of undersized galleys the weather gauge it needed to begin the work that the Galleasses had started. The wreckage is gone. Wood rots, iron corrodes. The sea is, as one historian noted, an unsentimental archivist. What remains is the light on the water and the story. The secret weapon is at the bottom somewhere. The weapon was never the galleass. The galleass was just wood and iron and the ballistic mathematics of heavy guns mounted low in the water. The real weapon was the understanding, achieved after 40 years of fear and failure and accommodation, that the thing everyone feared was not fate. It was a fleet. And on a gray October morning in the Gulf of Patras, a 24-year-old prince and 6 enormous ships proved it. The myth died. The sea remained. And somewhere in the cold water of the Gulf of Patras, the 6 galleasses that began it all lie beneath 2,000 years of sediment and silence, keeping their secret in the only way that history ultimately keeps anything, by becoming part of the ground itself.